Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. My dear brothers and sisters, respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. A very good afternoon and welcome to the Talking Point TV show with myself, Ahmad Bostan and Qadri, live and interactive on Noor TV, Sky Channel 819 across Europe and throughout the world in hundreds of countries. I'm, of course, your host for today's program, and as you know, we are, of course, Noor TV's official weekly current affairs show in English, talking about everything that's new locally, nationally, and even internationally. Incidentally, if you have any comments or questions about the show, want to suggest topics, guests that we can bring on, then please do get in touch with Noor TV and we'll be more than happy to take on your suggestions. I hope you had a beautiful Ramadan. I hope you also had a very good Eid, so a belated Ramadan Mubarak and Eid Mubarak from me. But today we're going to be talking about something that I think has dominated the month of Ramadan, the month of August in general actually, the riots. They spread all across the UK and caused a lot of media attention, rightfully so, when a group of young people decided to go out and cause trouble. A small minority, I think it's important to mention. However, should we just see the riots as a blatant act of criminality, treat it like every other crime? It was just a load of thugs engaging in this behaviour, not representative of the younger generation? Or are there any underlying factors that we need to look at? How did the police and the authorities, politicians, cope with what they were seeing across the country, in Birmingham, London, Liverpool, and various other towns and cities? I'm happy to say that to discuss this topic with me, I have three fantastic panelists. Sean Simon is the former Minister for Further Education and Creative Industries and the former Member of Parliament for Birmingham Erdington, and is currently concentrating on the mayoral election that will be going on very soon. Before you know it, will be here. Camille Ade-John is a community worker in Lozells and East Handsworth, where a lot of the trouble here in Birmingham took place. And Councillor Waseem Zaffar, in need of no introduction, I think. I'm sure you all know who he is. He has, of course, worked in the community for many years as a senior activist, but is now an elected councillor at Birmingham City Council, the largest council in Europe. Welcome to all three of you. Thank you very much for giving up your valuable time to be with us. If I could start off with yourself, Councillor Zaffar, just put into perspective what we saw on that Thursday night and thereafter.
On the Thursday night in North London, in the Tottenham area of North London, there was an incident where the police were involved, which led to the death of Mark Duggan, a African Caribbean gentleman who died in police contact, and that is currently being investigated. Very quickly after that, there was investigations pursued by the Metropolitan Police and also the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Along with that, there was obviously immense tension in the community. Rumours were flying around as to the cause of the death, which led to a protest on the Saturday afternoon that the family were involved in. It was a peaceful protest. Members of that protest then spread out and decided to cause some trouble. The family very quickly distanced, the family and friends of Mark Duggan quickly distanced themselves from any form of trouble, and that trouble swept right through North London and across areas in London on the Saturday and the Sunday and the weekend. On the Monday night, some of those incidents were repeated here in Birmingham City Centre. Originally, the police had heard rumours that there was problems going to be taking place in Birmingham City Centre, mainly through intelligence they received through social media. On the Monday evening from about 6:30, trouble broke out in Birmingham City Centre with what I would consider a fairly small group of young people, 40 to 50 young people. The group started to grow, many were watching on. Once the police took control of the situation and they dispersed some of those young people out of the city, some ended up in the Handsworth area of Birmingham, and the Soho Road became victim on that first Monday night. About a dozen shops were attacked, mainly of high-value goods or banks. That led to other trouble, but there was a few cars put on fire. On the following night, in the Winston Green area, there was an incident that took place, which we believe now 3 cars were potentially involved. that led to the tragic death of 3 young British Pakistanis. There was also trouble not far from these particular studios. In fact, a stone's way from these studios at the Drum and the Barton Arms in Newtown and Aston. So trouble escalated across northwest Birmingham. There was further trouble in Manchester, in Liverpool and other areas. And as far as I'm concerned, I know we're going to go on to discuss this, it was just copycat criminality. They weren't particularly targeting any particular ethnic group. They were it was people of all ethnic groups targeting any shop of high value goods that they can get hold of. And basically creating vandalism.
Councillor Zaffar, whilst all the disturbances were going on, many of our viewers would have either saw it firsthand or seen it in the media on the various news channels that were broadcasting the disturbances blow by blow, as it were. Do you think that the media were responsible in the way that they broadcast the material, or when you were watching the images yourself on radio, television, or reading in the newspapers, is there a danger that perhaps a lot of young people and specific ethnic communities were slightly demonized in all of this, wrongly so?
I think first and foremost, the role of the media. I think the media need to understand that at times such as this, when there is in a way a national crisis, they need to report with responsibility. I think most of the mainstream channels do report with that responsibility. There was 1 or 2 that didn't. As far as I'm concerned, if the riots didn't, or the disturbances rather, if they didn't start in London, and I don't think we would have had problems here in Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, or any other towns. I think, unfortunately, many of the young people saw on the media that that people in London have started disturbances. It's time to put our city or town on the map to say we've also replicated that. In terms of demonising particular ethnic groups, I think if we have a look, and I've spoken to senior officers here in the West Midlands Police, and I'm sure if we speak to the Home Office in terms of the figures from the other policing areas, most of the people that have been arrested are from, or rather, the people that have been arrested are from different ethnic groups, and it's rather representative of the area that they're from. So if we have a large, for instance, Aston has a predominantly large Muslim community. If there were disturbances in Aston, which there weren't, I'd imagine that a lot of the people that have been arrested would be from the Muslim community. I'm not saying that this would happen. So the people that have been arrested are rather representative of the communities that they're from, rather than one particular ethnic group. I think sometimes we need to understand, and the media should be far more responsible, and we as a community need to understand the issues far better. We can't just pinpoint one community.
Sure. Camille, Ade-John, you've worked in the community for many years and done extensive work, especially in the most deprived areas of Birmingham. Something that was mentioned repeatedly during the disturbances was the role of parents, although by way of looking at how many young people there are living in the UK, for example, or living in the specific cities, we can say that there were a significant number of people, but they are still very much a minority that cause the disturbances. But the role of their parents was very much brought into question. What do you think the role of parents is in today's society in light of what we've seen over the past month or so?
But thank you. I mean, I think just before I respond to that, I think in a lot of this, what has been lost has been the fact that a young, it so happened to be African Caribbean man was killed in London, and that what was said even by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, that a shot was fired or whatever, turned out to be untrue. The shot that was fired on the police or hit the police was from a police gun, and so that's one of the things. And the fact of the matter is, the families had been asking for some explanation. What happened? They marched because nobody would talk to them, and when they got to the police station, they were leaving because nobody still was coming out to talk to them. My understanding is a young girl of 16 went to police to ask for direction or something. Something took place, and she was hit and that was what kicked off the whole disturbance. But we don't get that reported because I suppose it's not what they want to sensationalize. So what I'm saying is we need to look back on what has happened, and the fact is it wasn't the first African Caribbean or from other communities that has been killed in the custody of the police that has had no satisfactory outcome. So that is the background to that. I think in terms of what has happened across the country and young people, my understanding again is that, in fact, there were people in Birmingham, I think, up to age 58. Yeah? So I think the amplification of what has occurred by the media is certainly a major concern to me and to a lot of people in the community.
But of course, Camille, Ade-John, it does bring into question, does it not, the role of parents in general?
Oh yes, and I am coming to that. But there has to be some laying of the background and the facts here. Sensationalism sells newspaper or encouraging people to watch the whatever station. Yeah, parents have always done and will always have a major role to play in the socialization of the young. Yeah, at the primary stage, your parent is the significant other, and that carries on. I do believe that it is clear from the work we've done over the years that there are parents who need support in ensuring that children are brought up with civic values and responsibilities. That is not always the case but it is not a simplistic thing where you can just simply say, oh, they're bad, and therefore, we must find them, get them out of their houses, and so on.
Sure. We
have to put in systems to ensure that is taking place. And I think some parents, there has to be something where you say, look, you have a responsibility, you're a parent, you ought to be looking after your child. What is a 14-year-old doing outside, or a 10-year-old doing in the city centre at 10 p.m. at night? It is unacceptable.
Sure. Sean Simon, over the first few nights of these disturbances across the country, in London, in Birmingham and various other places, there was an evident lack of police presence in the view of some people. It was only when the Prime Minister returned and called for 10,000 more police officers to be deployed in London, 500 more here in Birmingham city centre, did the police start to show a presence. What do you think were the main reasons why we didn't have that adequate police presence there sooner, and what do you think of the way in which the police reacted to all these disturbances?
Let me just take issue with you there on one thing there, Ahmad. You sounded as though you were giving some credit to the Prime Minister for taking a firm hand in this. Let's be clear, the Prime Minister let the country down in the hopeless way that they mishandled this situation. The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor of the Exchequer were all on holiday, and they all refused to come back, and they refused, and they continued to refuse, and they refused again, and they didn't come back until well after people were dying and the streets were on fire and the citizens of the country were scared. Then they agreed to come back from that particular holiday, although they soon went back off on holiday again. So let's be clear that there was no firm hand from the Prime Minister. He let us down. The police clearly were taken by surprise.
Yes. My
view is that it's not surprising that they were taken by surprise. I think we were all taken by surprise. And a lot of people, well, I think it's also quite clear in terms of the copycatting that went on, that seeing on the television police officers appearing to stand by and watch people looting shops was definitely a factor in persuading young people in cities outside London, and perhaps persuading young people across London as it initially spread in that big conurbation, that, hey, you seem to be able to do this and get away with it. Let's have a go at it. And I think as a result, a lot of people in the communities that suffered, and as is so often the case, it's the communities that can least afford to suffer that end up suffering at these times. Lots of people that I've talked to, shopkeepers and business owners and just ordinary people who are frightened, felt very angry towards the police and said, what are they doing? They're just standing by. Where were they? Why were they on Soho Road? Why were they standing at the end of the street guarding the police station when rioters were smashing up the shops and terrorising small businessmen? And I understand that fear. And I understand why people feel aggrieved. What I would say, though, is that we need to remember the history of policing in this country over the last 20 years and over the last 10. Yeah, and particularly in communities like some of ours in Birmingham and in the rest of the country, where there have been times in the past where relations between the police and different groups in the community were very difficult, very strained, where people felt that the police, frankly, were brutal and frankly racist and were not policing the streets in a decent and even-handed way. Certainly when I grew up in Handsworth in the 1980s, the police did not feel like the kind of presence that I think most of the time in Birmingham they feel like now. And so the only thing I would say to people is, when you're demanding tough action from the police, remember that the rest of the time in communities like we have here, we don't necessarily want tough action from the police. We don't necessarily want them charging in with batons raised every time they see a group of young lads standing on a street corner, particularly in areas where there are sometimes very pressured communities. And there's a danger, if people are not careful, that they end up demanding the kind of unthinking, brutal police that we had 30 years ago.
Sean, Simon, in light of what you said, would you say, therefore, that the lack of presence in terms of the most senior politicians in the country for many nights while all these disturbances were going on, the vandalising of shops, the 3 tragic deaths that we saw here in Birmingham, for example, the police needed that green light, I suppose, would you say, from those politicians in order for them to move forward and start reacting in the way that they were supposed to?
Well, I just say, that's not my understanding, that from what has been said, the police did not need the Prime Minister to tell them how to police. Yeah?
Nevertheless, there was a massive lack of leadership. There was a huge failure by the national political leadership, by David Cameron and his cronies in the government. They weren't here, they didn't come back. As usual, they didn't care, and as usual, they acted in a lily-livered, half-hearted way and did nothing. But in Birmingham and in other big cities in the UK, there was no leadership. There was nobody in Birmingham from the political establishment speaking for the people, articulating people's fears. There were 2 or 3 days last month when across the nation, and certainly in Birmingham, something quite extraordinary and difficult was happening. The whole city was shutting down in the middle of the afternoon. People were genuinely frightened. People didn't understand what was going on, and the complete lack of leadership in this city was incredibly visible and really disgraceful.
Ahmad, can I just come into the debate regarding the policing? And I think it's important to say there's lessons to be learned here. The police, on that particular Monday when the disturbances broke out in Birmingham City Centre and Handsworth, had only 144 trained riot officers working here in the city centre and here across the city. They had other officers who were not trained sitting back, acting really as the eyes and ears for the riot officers, and they weren't allowed to go in and assist the riot police because they're not trained to do so. However, later on in that week, there was up to 6,000 riot trained officers working in the city of Birmingham. So I think that the Chief Constable and the West Midlands Police Authority need to stand up and really tell us what we know they're feeling, and which is that there's a lack of resources here. And I know the debate's going to go on to the cuts in terms of youth activities, but the cuts in the police are playing a huge role here. The lack of police officers in my ward in Lozells and East Handsworth has clearly in the last 12 months had a negative impact on the relationship between the police and the community. And Lozells in 81, 85 and 2005 when we had disturbances in Birmingham was at the heart of it. However, the relationship between 2005 and last year, 2010, before this Chief Constable changed the structure of the West Midlands Police with his programme Paragon, was the best I've ever seen it. And that was because of two particular reasons. That was the introduction of neighbourhood policing and PCSOs. They play a huge role because PCSOs are not police officers. They're there to assist the community, to support the community, exactly what their title says. So I think there's lessons to be learned that there was some positive policing. However, because the resources have been taken away from areas such as Lozells, Handsworth, that relationship isn't there what it used to be.
However, the government, I suppose, would argue that the cuts that they're making to policing are, of course, cuts. We can't move away from that, but they perhaps may say that they're trying to protect the front line, at least, of the policing structure there, Councillor Zaffar.
In terms of the cuts, have we benefited from these cuts? Because the month of August has cost this government and the police forces up and down millions and millions of pounds of extra resources they've had to bring in, and that's happened partially because of the cuts they've originally made. So we're not benefiting. I think if you look at, there's areas of the city of Birmingham where you can possibly take some frontline officers away. The relationship between the police and the community, hasn't been an issue in the past, and they can, move away, and we can see cuts implemented there. However, if you ever look at where we've had disturbances across northwest Birmingham, some of the most deprived areas in the country, some of the areas where criminality has generally been high for decades, for the last 30, 40 years, can we afford to have less officers in areas such as Lozells, Handsworth, Aston, Newtown, Winson Green, which were deeply affected by the problems?
The government would argue that they're trying their best to protect the services and they need to make these cuts in their opinion. But we are going to take a short break now. We'll be back after this talking more about the riots.